Hi, Reuben Swartz here, your host and chief nerd. Welcome to Sales for Nerds, where I try to distill years of struggling with sales and marketing so you can learn the easy way. Plus, get the scoop from other folks who've accidentally ended up in sales and learned that it doesn't have to suck. Now, as a software person who hated conventional CRMs, I ended up creating my own for folks like me in professional services who would rather be doing client work than sales and marketing. It's got a whole new take on lead magnets, a new way to think about conversations and referrals, proposal automation, e-signature, and if you're the only one in your company selling, or maybe the only person in your company, it's got features so you don't feel so alone. Start your free trial at Mimiran.com. That's Mimiran.com. And even if you're not looking for a CRM, you'll find proposal templates, checklists, and more to help you grow your business. Now let's get to it. Reuben here, and as you know, I usually have guests on the podcast, but at the end of last year, I did an episode talking about some things I'd learned over the previous decade, and people seemed to like it. Now, as someone told me back in April, this year has been a long decade, and that was back in April, so I thought I'd do another episode of what I'd learned in this year of a decade. Let's start with some good news. In case anyone was wondering, the crazy overscheduling of our kids' lives is not healthy. While attending school over Zoom and not getting to hang out with friends in normal situations is not good at all, not rushing all over town at all hours and eating dinner on the run and getting to bed too late and never having a moment to think is no good either. We probably have more family dinners together now than we did before. Second, COVID puppies. We finally got a dog. My wife said, if we don't do it now, when would we do it? Along with half our neighborhood, it seems, so she has lots of companions. The first couple months were pretty rough, but Barley, my VP of HR, is a wonderful addition to the family. On a different biological subject, and perhaps the one with the most long-lasting implications, mRNA vaccines are here. And while it certainly seems like an interminable wait, at least for me, the world has turned around a vaccine very quickly. The actual construction of the vaccine took just a matter of days. The rest is really just the testing. Now, if you're not familiar with mRNA, I've seen a lot of weird stuff floating around on the interwebs, and I'm not exactly a biologist, but the basic idea is, well, let's start with DNA, which people generally know encodes the genes that instruct the cell to make particular proteins. But the DNA is in the nucleus. Well, mostly. Some still hangs out in the mitochondria, at least in eukaryotic creatures like people and trees and ants and so on that have an actual nucleus. There's nothing like the exceptions to rules in biology. But the ribosomes are where the proteins get made. So RNA, like the DNA, is a chain of nucleotides. Most people think it evolved before DNA. And when the cell needs to create a protein, enzymes unzip the double-stranded DNA and start making an RNA copy of the relevant section of the chromosome. Of course, because it's biology, and let's just say there's a lot of technical debt in evolution, other enzymes have to trim out some non-coding chunks of DNA called introns, and then you're left with a strand of RNA that actually codes for the protein that can travel from the nucleus to the ribosome to deliver the message, messenger RNA, you might say, or mRNA. Now, for the first time, people are using mRNA directly to instruct the body's ribosomes to create a protein that's not encoded in the cell's own DNA. In this case, the spike protein of the COVID virus, so the body can recognize it as foreign and start developing an immune response. Now, I don't want to pretend that this is trivial or that we should be reckless about it, but this is not as bizarre as some of the things we've seen. It's not going to affect your DNA. mRNA deteriorates within days, sometimes a lot faster. And while I'm sure this will get horribly abused at some point, it's literally a lifesaver right now, and it's going to come in very handy in dealing with future pandemics because this is certainly not going to be the last one unless we somehow fail to make it through this one. Why not? Well, viruses have always been with us, and with more people in closer proximity to more animals and a more connected globe, we're going to have more events where an animal virus jumps to people, perhaps with one or more mutations that make it a pandemic starter. Note that what has made COVID-19 such a huge problem is not the virulence of the viral attack itself, but in many cases, the virus seems pretty much dormant or asymptomatic in people for some time, which means the virus can spread a lot before we can stop it. Which leads me to another piece of good news. Countries that followed good epidemiological practices, wearing masks, self-quarantining, vigorous contact tracing, that kind of stuff like South Korea and New Zealand, contained their outbreaks and life returned to relative normality relatively quickly. Which leads me to some inevitable bad news. Well, America has not exactly been a healthcare leader for some time. We spend far more per capita on healthcare, but we have significantly shorter life expectancy than other quote-unquote developed countries. But at least we could say the CDC was pretty much the preeminent pandemic fighting organization on the planet. And I generally try to avoid politics here, but there's really no way to talk about the defining event of 2020 without talking about politics, because this is not so much of a healthcare failure as a political failure. And before you pigeonhole me politically, I've been called a Republican by Democrats and a Democrat by Republicans, and I really don't much like either party, but that's a whole separate conversation. But before we get to that, I'd like to compare this to something that happened almost 20 years ago, which feels like it would be about July, but I'm actually talking about 2001. We had some intelligence failures, and a jerk murdered almost 3,000 Americans. And as a country, we dealt with this situation, I would say, less than ideally. We pursued the actual perpetrators half-heartedly. We flew their relatives out of the country. We spent trillions of dollars and thousands of lives dropping bombs on people who weren't the perpetrators. We set up an eerily named Department of Homeland Security, had the NSA listen to our phone calls, orchestrated a vast torture apparatus, and effectively suspended parts of the Constitution. Then we accused people who were worried about the practical, ethical, or constitutional implications of not being sufficiently patriotic. It was a betrayal of American ideals, in my opinion, and a giant waste, a slush fund for the military-industrial complex, to which Congress granted seemingly infinite funds, but they got all stingy when it came to healthcare for a handful of first responders at the World Trade Center or the veterans we sent to fight the longest wars in American history. Now let's jump forward to this year. We have a pandemic across the globe. The president gets briefed. The Senate Intelligence Committee gets briefed. They knew. And instead of saying we've got a big problem and it's going to be hard and here's how we're going to get through it with as little death and suffering as possible, Trump told us it was a hoax because people were jealous of how great a president he was. Now, such a ridiculous statement shouldn't have mattered, but a lot of other people got in on the action. Fox and other Trump-friendly media outlets repeated these claims. Senators who knew better dumped their stocks while telling the public everything was fine. Basic precautions like wearing a mask became political statements. I've seen absurd things on social media from places that call themselves news outlets, claiming that driving is more deadly than COVID. People who were quite fine holding other people without due process and torturing them suddenly decided that masks were a massive infringement of personal liberties. And trying to point out the absurdity of this to people only seems to further entrench their beliefs. It's become something of a death cult. Some of the same people who were worried about a woman in a permanent vegetative state because we were supposed to be a quote-unquote culture of life, the people dropping bombs all over the place, now we're saying that people had to die for the sake of the economy. The White House did put together sort of a half-hearted effort to fight the virus, a pandemic task force headed up by a guy whose main qualification was being married to one of the president's daughters. This sounds absolutely crazy as I'm saying it, but it's true. Like Trump, he pretends to be a real estate developer, but he had to abuse his connections to get bailed out of a disastrous investment in Manhattan. Does this sound familiar? Again, this sounds nutty, but imagine if the official Obama response to Ebola was headed up by someone with no medical expertise who just happened to be dating one of his daughters. It's absurd. Unfortunately, it gets worse. Trump and Kushner decided that COVID was hitting blue states who weren't voting for Trump anyway. And as I mentioned, I wasn't exactly thrilled with our response to 9/11, but you didn't see Bush saying he didn't care because New York and D.C. voted for Democrats. Now, it's natural that a foreign virus would arrive in major cities with lots of foreign travel, and that it would spread from there if you didn't contain it. But these were not exactly epidemiologists that we're talking about, so they decided they weren't really going to fight the virus at a federal level because it was going to let the blue states look bad. They decided not to use federal supplies to help and told the states to bid for them. But even that wasn't enough. In some cases, they intercepted those supplies to pass off to cronies while grifting something off the top, I'm sure. All of this while claiming it was no big deal and it would magically disappear and master a terrible impingement on our liberties, and a huge echo chamber replayed these remarks along with other nonsense. One of the more interesting things I came across was something called One America News, which I really thought was the Onion News, based on sort of the deadpan, exaggerated person acting like a news anchor and the completely made-up statistics. But unfortunately, I've seen a lot of people online saying that you can't trust the quote-unquote mainstream media. Only places like One America News are quote-unquote reliable. And this explains a lot. And when I was younger, just to reveal how old I am, the Soviet Union was still around, and they had an official news channel called Pravda, which is Russian for truth, which was kind of a sick joke because it was nothing but nonsensical propaganda. And I remember telling my mom that I was glad that we had freedom of the press so we wouldn't have to deal with that. And I still remember she gave me one of those sighs, like she really didn't know how to explain this to a kid, but she said, "Don't be so sure." And of course, here we are, One American News. Of course, all news, all information comes from a certain perspective. That's the human condition. But there's a difference between perspective and pure propaganda, which has no regard for the truth itself, which is exactly what you get from One American News and the like. We've now lost over 300,000 Americans to COVID with no signs of it stopping. We've had the fatality equivalent of over 100 9/11s and huge losses from sickness, layoffs, and more. Now, a virus like this is a constant risk, and there's no way we could have prevented death and disruption entirely, but we have done a terrible job. We overreacted in many ways to 9/11, and here we are with an event orders of magnitude larger, and we're basically shrugging. Japan, with plenty of travel to and from China, and a little over the third of the population of the United States, has lost less than 4,000 lives, and with far less economic and social disruption. Let's be clear, we've all got a part in this, but blame starts at the top. It's basically as if we let bin Laden set up shop in the Oval Office with direct complicity and support from large sections of the government and media, with millions of Americans cheering him on, while he and his cronies stole billions of dollars and people died. That's basically what's going on here. A virus isn't even fully alive, let alone a political entity. It's a healthcare issue. And of course, healthcare issues do become political issues if they get big enough. But this is just absurd. Yesterday, I learned that a 41-year-old congressman-elect from Louisiana died from COVID, leaving behind a wife and 2 young children. He'd been out campaigning without masks or any sense of social distancing. Don't wish that on him or his family or even his constituents, but we're living in crazy times. I don't want to bring politics onto this podcast, but there's no choice. This crazy death cult has got to go. There are differences between feelings, imaginings, opinions, values, theories, and facts. As Isaac Asimov said, there's a cult of ignorance in the United States, and there always has been. The strain of anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. Now, hundreds of thousands of Americans have lost their lives because of this, and many others are battling other health issues or the financial strain of the pandemic. Of course, as an American, if you're listening outside the country, I'm sorry for the American-centric perspective. I know this is hitting lots of places all around the globe, but I think I'm interested in the American angle partly because I live here and partly because there's such an enormous gap between the potential we have and the actual outcome that we're getting. Now, I have it relatively good. I work from home anyway. My kids are old enough that they don't need constant attention. Puppy is another story, perhaps. My wife has delivered moms with COVID, and she's been okay, and so far so have her patients and the babies. But we know plenty of people who haven't been so lucky. What I have missed, even as an introvert, is the human connection. I haven't seen my parents since this all started. I don't know when I will. I stopped playing basketball. I can't hug friends and family. And I even miss things that I never really thought about before, like handshakes and pats on the shoulder, or just sitting down next to someone to work on something together instead of doing a screen share. In last year's episode, I talked a bit about how humans not only put other creatures in zoos, we've actually done the same thing to ourselves with the attendant effects on our mental and physical well-being. COVID has amped that up to a whole new level, disrupting the human connection that we all need, even us introverts. There's no perfect replacement for what we've lost, but that doesn't mean we can't try. My habit that I've developed over the past couple of years of picking up the phone rather than hiding behind technology has been very helpful. I've had great conversation with friends, family, clients, prospects, partners, vendors, and more all over the world. People I've known for a long time and people I probably wouldn't have met without the upheaval. Conversations are the important thing. They're the basic building blocks of connection. Now, as an introverted techie, I was intrigued by the possibilities of email and social media, and I still think they're a powerful force to enable deeper connection but not replace it. They're the fast food of the human social condition. Cheap, fast, convenient, but not very nourishing, especially if they make up the bulk of your social diet. Speaking of enabling technologies, it has been the year of Zoom. My kids go to school on it. I spend much of my day on it, and while I don't love it, it's a lot better than a phone call. I've been able to get closer to customers and partners, and the ability to record and save the calls, including screen shares, has been a great boon for training and onboarding. I've got standing Zoom calls with friends from high school, and in some ways I've seen more of some of them than I do in a typical year. And perhaps in some ways the current dystopia cuts away some of the BS from interactions. People I'm talking to, I want to talk to. It's not that I ran into them on the way to the coffee machine. Everyone's reassessing their priorities, considering what's really important, in their lives, in their relationships, and in their work. One of the more interesting calls I had was from a former customer who had been through my sales and marketing boot camp. She thanked me for the experience and said it had made her decide to retire, at least for now. In the boot camp, I asked people to really dig into why they do what they do, who they really want to do it for, and why it all matters. And she realized she was done with all that. The reason that had animated her when she was younger no longer applied, and she just didn't want to deal with it anymore. She didn't really want to tell me because she felt like maybe I would think she was giving up, but I congratulated her on her insight. And maybe I should start promoting the boot camp that way. Hey, you may end up retiring within a few months. I've talked to people struggling to stay afloat during the pandemic and people making global expansion plans, people teeming with enthusiasm and people at their wits' end, with sick parents, children home from elementary school or college trying to work whatever hours they could. If 2020 had been a quote-unquote normal year, whatever that means, I wouldn't have had some of those conversations. Perhaps I would have had others that were just as interesting, but I think likely not, because we're all forced to take stock. To do what I aim to do and what I tell you to do, to connect, teach, and help, rather than network, market, and sell, means having relationships with other people. Those are not solitary activities. And now that our connections are even more physically fragmented than before, we have to be more deliberate to build and maintain those connections, and perhaps to go deeper than when we discussed our commutes or our kids' basketball schedule. We have to do that with ourselves too. How can we connect, teach, and help ourselves if we don't know who we really are and what we really want? If we consume those most personal attributes from the environment around us, where the loudest voices are those simply encouraging more consumption for the profit of those voices, not only financially, but especially this year, often at the cost of our health and our lives. So my advice for 2021 is simple. Talk to people. This sounds silly, and the words don't even do it justice, because it sounds like we should be talking, when really talking to people is more about listening. For more on what listening really means, check out episode 43 with Oscar Trimboli. If you haven't, I promise it will be worth your while. So many people are shouting, at least metaphorically, trying to be heard, worrying if anyone is listening, and it can be hard to really listen to anything in the cacophony. Before the pandemic hit, I remember reading an article about the increase in psychotherapy visits amongst people who didn't seem to have quote-unquote real problems. The cause was a mystery, but the conclusion of the article was that so many people felt like that was the only place that anyone really listened to them. Pretty sad, but that's what can happen when you live in the zoo. We all have that need to be heard, to be understood, and also to really hear and understand someone else. Okay, maybe some psychopaths don't have that latter need. Talking to people, having conversations, asking questions, and really listening is what builds the connections we so badly need with our family and friends, as well as professionally. When we are talking, being able to share authentically so that people can help us. Here I'm going to drop some clues for a wonderful upcoming episode with Bob Berg of The Go-Giver. Stay tuned for that. So many people ask me how to write proposals, which is funny, almost a cosmic joke because I used to be so terrible at them. But the answer is not to ask me, it's to ask the prospect what they really need and figure it out in a conversation. I'm by no means parent of the year, but my wife and I have a pretty good connection to our kids, and sometimes people ask about it. And the first thing I say is that we talk about stuff. If they have a question, I try to answer it, however I can, in a way that they can understand. This usually leads to more questions and more conversations, and we share things about how we see the world with each other. Really talking to people, having conversations, not just small talk, is how we build that shared view of the world, one where people can have different paths, perspectives, and opinions, but agree on facts and in most cases on values. I think this is what E.M. Forster meant when he wrote, "Only connect." This is what we need to do in business to understand the client's needs, to create compelling proposals and set up successful projects. How can we do that if we don't connect on a deep level? There's some cool features in my software that I'm maybe a little too proud of that came to me because of deep conversations I had with users. And if I had just been hiding behind technology, automated emails, and so on, these things never would have occurred to me. Conversations are what we need with our friends and family, especially when we're robbed of the usual rituals of interaction. They're what we need to build a hopeful future, not the quasi-dystopian Onion article of a year we've seen in America, which would have been comedy, at least dark comedy, if it weren't so tragic, and had certainly covered farce. Then again, during this whole semi-quarantine, sometimes I find myself talking to my dog, so maybe I've just lost it. Or maybe I found something. She does seem like a good listener. Speaking of listening, thank you for listening. And I'd love to listen to your thoughts and or suggestions for upcoming episodes. You can shoot me a note at hello@salesfornerds.io. And of course, reviews are always great to get the word out and boost my ego, or not, depending on the review. Please be safe and take care of each other. Hopefully those mRNA vaccines will be broadly available soon. And best wishes for a healthy, prosperous, happy, and meaningful 2021. Have great conversations. Cheers. Thanks for listening. If you have a friend who would benefit from this episode, please pass the word along. Have a friend who wouldn't benefit, but you haven't talked to in a while, give them a call. iTunes reviews are great to get the word out and help me create the show that's most useful to you. And if you're frustrated with your sales and marketing process or lack thereof, check out Memorand, the CRM for people who hate selling. Until next time.